Absolute cold doesn't kill you instantly. He is waiting. He observes. And then it punishes every human error. For centuries, it was imagined that the Vikings survived Scandinavian winters through sheer brute force. Hardy warriors, men accustomed to pain, almost immune to the cold. The popular image shows figures wrapped in thick furs, drinking mead by the fire while blizzards roar outside. A simple narrative, seductive, but profoundly incomplete. Because the true secret to Viking survival lay not in strength, but in the silent understanding of heat. In Northern Europe, where winter could last for months mercilessly, temperatures below -30 degrees were not uncommon. The wind swept through fjords like invisible blades. The moisture froze before it even touched the ground. Under these conditions, the human body loses heat 4 times faster than it can produce it. The enemy was not just the cold, it was the gradual loss of vital energy itself. And yet, entire communities survived. Children grew up. The elderly grew old. Animals were raised. Ships continued to be built. The question then changes. No, how did they endure the cold? But how they learned to turn him into an ally. Modern archaeology has revealed something surprising. Viking houses were not just makeshift shelters against winter. They functioned as living organisms, designed to capture, store, and recycle human heat. Longhouses, the large communal houses, were long structures of wood and turf, partially buried in the ground. This was no accident. The earth, even when frozen on the surface, maintains much more stable temperatures a few centimeters below. By sinking their houses into the ground, the Vikings drastically reduced the heat loss caused by the polar wind. The ground became the first invisible barrier against winter. The exterior walls were covered with thick layers of peat, moss, and compacted earth. These natural materials acted as extraordinary thermal insulators. Unlike bare stone, which quickly absorbs heat, peat traps small pockets of air, and still air is the best insulator there is. Without knowing modern physics, they mastered a fundamental principle of thermodynamics. Heat doesn't need to be created in excess. It just needs to be prevented from escaping. Inside these houses, the organization of the space revealed another secret. The central fire was neither large nor intense. It was controlled, low, constant. The goal was not to heat up quickly, but to maintain a stable temperature over entire days. A strong fire heats up quickly, but it also consumes oxygen and fuel. A patient fire makes survival routine. Around this fire, people, tools, clothing, and animals shared the same thermal environment. Collective body heat became an essential part of the system. Every breath, every movement, every human presence contributed to warming the common space. The Vikings didn't fight the cold individually. They survived as a single body. Archaeological discoveries show that cattle often remained inside their own longhouses during the winter. At first glance, this seems uncomfortable. But biologically, it was brilliant. A single animal can release heat equivalent to several modern heaters over the course of a night. The smell, the vapor of animal breath, and the constant sound of life created something deeper than shelter, an artificial microclimate. The Viking house was, essentially, a living heat engine. But perhaps the most fascinating detail lies in their clothing. Contrary to the popular myth of heavy, stiff furs, the Vikings used multiple thin layers of wool. Wool retains its thermal properties even when wet, something crucial in regions where melting snow and condensation were inevitable. It wasn't the weight of the clothes that saved lives. It was the air trapped between them. Layer upon layer, the body created tiny, invisible chambers of heat. Human metabolism itself became the primary source of energy. Instead of constantly seeking external heat, they learned to conserve the heat that already existed within them. A silent philosophy emerges from this ancient engineering. Surviving doesn't mean producing more energy, but wasting less. While the wind howled outside, while the darkness of the Nordic winter swallowed the horizon for weeks, these communities lived in a delicate balance between nature and practical intelligence. Nothing was excessive. Nothing was random. Each architectural choice, each fabric, each position within the house was part of a body of knowledge accumulated over generations who learned, often at the cost of death, how to engage with the cold. And perhaps that's precisely what makes the Vikings less warriors and more engineers of the human environment. Because surviving the Arctic winter has never been an isolated act of courage. It was a system where the human body, architecture, animals, and landscape functioned together, as if they were parts of a single creature trying to stay alive under a frozen sky. And that's just the first layer of the mystery. The Scandinavian winter didn't begin when the snow fell. It began months earlier, in the unseen decisions of summer. For the Vikings, surviving temperatures of -30 degrees wasn't a reaction to the cold. It was planning against the inevitable. Unlike the modern view of emergency shelter, each Norse village functioned as an anticipatory system. Winter was treated as a known, predictable, almost personal entity. Archaeology shows that communities began thermal preparation even during the long days of summer. The position of houses, for example, was rarely random. Longhouses were strategically oriented against the prevailing north and west winds. Small natural elevations, gentle slopes, and rock formations were chosen not for the beauty of the terrain, but for the way they broke up cold air currents. The biggest enemy of heat has never been snow. It was the wind. Wind removes heat from the skin dozens of times faster than still air. Without understanding physical equations, the Vikings intuitively mastered the modern concept of wind chillby blocking the constant flow of air. They drastically reduced the energy loss from the human body. Some excavations have revealed extremely narrow entrances and curved corridors before the main living space of the house. For a long time, it was believed that these were simple structural choices. Today, we know that they functioned as primitive thermal chambers. The cold air was coming in, but it wasn't moving forward. Each door acted as a temperature trap. Hot air remained trapped inside the dwelling, while the outside cold was dissipated before reaching the heart of the house. It was climate engineering applied with wood, earth, and empirical observation. And then an almost invisible detail emerges: the height of the ceiling. Longhouses weren't tall. The interior space remained relatively low by modern standards. This wasn't a technical limitation, it was thermal efficiency. Heat rises. The smaller the volume of air above people, the less energy is needed to heat the living space. They didn't heat the entire house. They only heated the space where life took place. At night, when the outside temperature reached extreme levels, human behavior became an essential part of thermal engineering. Sleeping alone would be dangerous. Instead, entire families rested close to one another, often sharing blankets and sleeping surfaces elevated from the ground. The human body at rest releases about 100 watts of continuous thermal heat. 10 people gathered together produce energy equivalent to a small modern heating system. The Vikings understood something fundamental. Human heat was not just biological, it was collective. Sleeping together was not just a cultural tradition, it was survival technology. The beds were positioned along the interior walls, away from entrances, and protected by wooden structures that reduced internal drafts. Furs and fabrics served not only as blankets, but also as barriers against thermal convection. Even the choice of materials reveals surprising intelligence. Wool dominated Nordic clothing not for luxury, but for natural science. Unlike linen or stiff leather, wool has microscopic wavy fibers that trap warm air. When damp, it continues to insulate, something vital in environments where ice constantly melts and refreezes. Viking clothing did not directly combat the cold. It prevented the body from losing what it had already produced. And perhaps the most impressive element is the food. Surviving extreme cold requires a constant supply of metabolic fuel. Excavations at Viking settlements reveal diets extremely rich in animal fat. Fish, meat, fermented dairy products, and thick broths. Fat has more than twice the energy density of carbohydrates. Each meal was, essentially, internal thermal storage. Human metabolism efficiently transforms fat into heat. Eating wasn't just about nourishing oneself, it was about warming oneself from the inside. In severely sub-zero temperatures, the body can consume thousands of calories a day just to maintain a stable core temperature. The fire warmed the house, but the food warmed the blood. During the long nights of the Nordic winter, when the sun barely rose above the horizon, survival also depended on something less tangible: the psychological rhythm of the community. Prolonged darkness could destroy the human mind even before the body succumbed to the cold. Historians suggest that storytelling, music, manual labor, and shared tales around the fire were not simply entertainment. They were cognitive mechanisms for emotional preservation. Mental warmth sustained physical warmth. Because the human body reacts to despair by reducing metabolic activity, movement, and motivation, factors that accelerate hypothermia. Keeping the spirit active meant keeping the body alive. Thus, within these semi-buried houses, enveloped in snow and silence, the Vikings created something extraordinary: a closed human ecosystem where architecture, food, clothing, social behavior, and biology worked together to withstand the most hostile environment in Europe. They didn't survive because they were stronger than winter. They survived because they learned to think like him. And there is an even deeper aspect, perhaps the most unexpected of all, to how the Vikings transformed their own bodies into a tool for climate adaptation. Extreme cold doesn't just attack the skin. It interferes with decisions, alters movements, and reprograms human behavior itself. Throughout the centuries, it was believed that the Vikings simply endured impossible temperatures thanks to exceptional physical endurance. But modern studies of human physiology suggest something different. The secret wasn't in tolerating the cold, but in training the body to cooperate with it. The adaptation process began in childhood. Nordic children were not isolated from the icy environment. They grew up gradually exposed to the cold, allowing their bodies to develop specific metabolic responses. The human body has natural mechanisms capable of increasing internal heat production, but only when constantly stimulated. Today, we call this process thermal acclimation. For the Vikings, it was simply about living. Frequent exposure to cold activates a special type of tissue known as brown fat. Unlike regular fat, which functions to store energy, brown fat burns calories directly to produce heat. It's a silent, almost invisible biological system capable of transforming the body into a small internal furnace. Modern communities rarely fully activate this mechanism. Constantly warm environments prevent the development of this adaptation. The Vikings, however, lived daily with temperatures low enough to stimulate this natural process. The result was not immunity to the cold, but with superior energy efficiency. Movement was also carefully adjusted. Working excessively outdoors could cause sweating, and sweat in a polar climate becomes an immediate danger. Damp clothing drastically accelerates heat loss. Therefore, outdoor activities were performed in short, controlled cycles. to move enough to generate heat, stop before it produces moisture. This physical discipline reveals a deep understanding of human thermal balance. The goal was not to stay constantly warm, but to avoid extremes, neither too cold nor too hot. Even breathing was part of that system. Ethnographic excavations and analysis indicate that scarves, cloaks, and high collars served not only to protect the neck. They warmed inhaled air before it reached the lungs. Breathing extremely cold air can rapidly reduce internal body temperature. By filtering the air through fabrics, the Vikings created a natural pre-warming of their breath. Each breath of inspiration became a survival strategy. Another intriguing detail emerges in the daily organization of time. During the deep winter, the pace of life slowed down drastically. Less commuting, fewer outdoor tasks, more indoor and repetitive activities. It wasn't seasonal laziness, it was collective energy conservation. The human body consumes enormous amounts of calories just to maintain its core temperature. Reducing unnecessary movement meant prolonging food reserves and conserving metabolic heat. The entire village operated as an organism in a state of vital economy. Even the interior lighting contributed to the thermal balance. Small, steady lamps made of animal fat released additional heat while providing soft light. Nothing was wasted. Each flame had a dual purpose: heat and vision, energy and survival. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect lies in the Vikings' psychological relationship with the cold. Unlike the modern mindset, which treats winter as something to be overcome, the Nordic peoples developed an almost philosophical acceptance of the seasons. Winter was not an enemy. It was an inevitable phase of the natural cycle. This perception altered human behavior. The constant fear of cold increases physiological stress, accelerates energy loss, and impairs decision-making. By accepting winter as part of existence, the Vikings eliminated panic and preserved essential mental resources. Survival became calm. Saga after saga describes long periods of silence, craftsmanship, stories passed down orally, and contemplation by the fire. Instead of fighting the darkness, they learned to live within it. And this is perhaps the greatest discovery revealed by modern climate archaeology. The Vikings did not conquer winter through physical strength or advanced technology. They survived because they aligned body, mind, and environment into a single adaptive system. Every gesture, every habit, every daily choice reinforced the retention of human warmth, not just in the body, but in the entire community. Still, there is one last layer to this forgotten knowledge, an invisible element that connects architecture, biology, and culture into something greater than mere survival. Something that reveals why, even under temperatures capable of freezing the sea, life continued to thrive in the northern lands. The real mystery was never how the Vikings survived the cold. The mystery is why we've forgotten how to survive in our own environments. When the Nordic winter reached its peak, the world seemed suspended between life and silence. The sun disappeared for weeks, the sky became a pale band over frozen mountains, and the wind carried ice particles capable of erasing footprints in minutes. Nothing there favored humankind. No condition seemed hospitable. And yet, life went on. Inside the longhouses, warmth didn't just come from the central fire. It arose from collective breathing, careful movement, shared food, and knowledge passed down through generations. The warmth was produced by a profound understanding that humankind cannot survive alone, nor against nature. The Vikings never tried to conquer winter. They learned to belong to him. Every detail of our existence reveals a forgotten truth. Survival does not depend on the quantity of resources available, but on the intelligence with which we use what we already possess. The human body has always been a powerful source of energy. Community has always been the best shelter. Observing nature has always been the most advanced technology. While modern civilizations build barriers against the climate, the Nordic peoples built a dialogue with it. They understood something that science only confirmed centuries later. The most efficient heat is not that produced externally, but that which we manage to preserve internally. Architecture, clothing, food, social behavior, and mentality were not separate parts of Viking life. They were a single integrated system, practical knowledge shaped by necessity, refined by experience, and protected by tradition. Winter taught limits, and the Vikings learned to respect them. Perhaps that is why their stories have stood the test of time, not merely as accounts of war or maritime exploration, but as testaments to extreme human adaptation. They proved that survival doesn't require eliminating discomfort. It requires understanding it. Today, surrounded by technology, artificial heating, and constant comfort, we rarely think of warmth as something precious. But for those northern peoples, each spark was the result of cooperation between body, mind, and environment. The cold shaped their culture, necessity shaped his intelligence, and survival shaped his worldview. In the silence of a Viking night, while snow covered the outside and the fire slowly breathed in the center of the house, there was no sense of victory over nature. There was balance, a profound understanding that humankind is not separate from the natural world. It is part of it. Perhaps this is the true legacy left by the Vikings. No ships, no battles. But remember that the most powerful knowledge is born when we learn to live in harmony with the forces we cannot control. If this documentary has sparked your curiosity about humanity's forgotten knowledge, subscribe to the channel to continue exploring stories where science, history, and survival intersect. Because sometimes the past isn't so far away. He's just waiting to be rediscovered.